Padre Pio's secret diary reveals a demon's name. Not just any demon. The Tempter, an entity so strategic that physical torment was merely prologue. While the world celebrated stigmata and miracles, inside those hidden pages lived a different story. A spiritual assassination attempt that used Padre Pio's own faith as the weapon against him. The Church canonized the victory, but buried the battlefield. This is the investigation into the diary they didn't want you to read, the demon they didn't want you to fear, and the tactic that could break anyone. What if the greatest spiritual attack isn't violence, but the whisper that God has turned away? The Vatican archives hold millions of documents, but some remain sealed not by time, but by decision. Among the relics of Padre Pio's life, his blood-stained gloves, his recorded confessions, his letters to spiritual directors, there existed a diary that church officials accessed only under strict protocol, a collection of private writings where the Capuchin friar documented experiences he shared with no congregation, no biographer, no curious pilgrim seeking miracles. This was not the sanitized testimony presented during canonization proceedings, not the carefully edited spiritual reflections published for the faithful, but raw accounts of warfare that occurred in the hours between midnight prayers and dawn, when the monastery fell silent and the battle turned intimate. Researchers who pursued access to these documents encountered barriers that seemed less about historical preservation and more about protective concealment, as if the church hierarchy understood that certain truths about spiritual combat were too destabilizing for public consumption, too psychologically dangerous for believers who came to Padre Pio seeking comfort rather than confrontation with the mechanisms of supernatural assault. The entries in question span from the winter of 1922 through the scorching summer of 1928, a 6-year period that coincided with Padre Pio's most intense physical suffering from the stigmata. Yet the diary reveals that the bleeding wounds were perhaps the least of his torments. He wrote in Italian, sometimes in fragments, as if the act of recording these encounters drained him of linguistic coherence, his handwriting deteriorating from neat script to desperate scrawls across pages that show water damage, not from moisture but from what appears to be tears or sweat, bodily testimony to the state in which these words were composed. Within these entries, one name appears with haunting frequency, written sometimes in quotation marks, sometimes underlined with such force that the pen tore through the paper, a designation he gave to the primary antagonist of this spiritual siege. He called this presence the Tempter, distinguishing it from other demonic manifestations he experienced, from the physical assaults that left scratches and bruises, from the nocturnal disturbances that other monks occasionally witnessed, from the voices that screamed obscenities during his attempts at Mass, because this particular demon employed a methodology that was surgical in its precision, psychological in its devastation. The Tempter did not attack Padre Pio's flesh with the crude violence that characterized lesser demonic encounters. There were no dramatic levitations before witnesses, no theatrical manifestations that could be documented by the church investigators who scrutinized every claimed supernatural occurrence in the friar's life. Instead, as the diary reveals, this entity conducted a campaign of spiritual dismantling that operated through whispers positioned at the exact intersection of Padre Pio's greatest devotion and his deepest vulnerability. The attacks came during prayer itself, during the very moments when Padre Pio sought connection with the divine, transforming his spiritual disciplines into torture chambers of doubt. The Tempter would inject thoughts that mimic divine communication in tone and texture, making it nearly impossible for Padre Pio to distinguish between his own conscience, demonic suggestion, and authentic spiritual guidance. One entry from March 1925 describes kneeling before the crucifix in his cell, attempting the contemplation exercises that had once brought him peace, only to experience what he recorded as a voice that spoke with the familiarity of a spiritual director, questioning whether his suffering was punishment rather than participation in Christ's passion, whether the stigmata were marks of divine favor or evidence of his own spiritual corruption manifesting physically. What made the Tempter's methodology so devastating was its foundation in theological sophistication. This was not a demon who tempted with obvious sins, with promises of worldly pleasure or power that a devoted friar could easily recognize and reject. The tempter weaponized Padre Pio's own religious formation, his years of study in moral theology, his deep understanding of sin and redemption, turning this knowledge into a maze of spiritual paranoia. The diary entries reveal that the tempter convinced Padre Pio to question whether his mystical experiences were genuine, or whether he had become subject to delusion, whether the thousands who sought his blessing were being misled by a fraud, whether every prayer he offered was an insult to God because it came from lips that might be unworthy. This was spiritual judo, using the force of Padre Pio's devotion against itself, making his very sanctity the source of his torment. Church officials who reviewed these entries during the canonization process understood the danger of this material, how it could be weaponized by those who already doubted the validity of mystical experience, how it could shake the faith of believers who imagined that sainthood meant exemption from such profound spiritual crisis, how it revealed that the closer one drew to divine union, the more sophisticated and personal the demonic opposition became. The historical record shows that Padre Pio's spiritual directors knew something was occurring beyond normal spiritual dryness or dark night of the soul experiences described in classical mystical literature. Letters between these directors and Vatican officials reference concerns about the friar's psychological state, debates about whether his experiences indicated genuine supernatural assault or symptoms of pathology that required medical rather than spiritual intervention. But what these officials could not see, what remained hidden in the diary, was the specific mechanism of the tempter's assault, the way this demon had analyzed Padre Pio's spiritual architecture and located the exact structural weakness that could bring the entire edifice crashing down. That weakness was not pride or lust or any conventional sin, but rather the saint's absolute dependence on the certainty of God's love and presence, his need to believe that his suffering had redemptive meaning, that his pain participated in divine purpose rather than existing as meaningless torment inflicted on a deluded man. The tempter understood that if this certainty could be eroded, if doubt could be seeded into the foundation of Padre Pio's faith, the resulting collapse would be total, and the demon documented in these pages was willing to invest years in this psychological siege, patient as only an immortal intelligence could be. By late 1927, the diary entries show Padre Pio in a state of spiritual crisis that bordered on despair, using language that would horrify the pilgrims who traveled thousands of miles to kiss his wounded hands. He wrote of feeling abandoned by God, of wondering whether the decades of prayer and sacrifice had been rejected, whether he had misunderstood his entire vocation, whether the suffering that he had embraced as his path to holiness was actually evidence of his damnation. These were not the temporary doubts of a struggling believer, but the systematic dismantling of a saint's faith, conducted with the precision of a master torturer who knows exactly how much pressure to apply, when to relent to prevent complete breakdown, when to intensify the assault to prevent recovery. The church that would eventually present Padre Pio as a triumph of faith over evil was understandably reluctant to publicize the full extent of how close the tempter came to succeeding, how near this canonized saint came to spiritual annihilation, because the implications were too disturbing for comfortable theology. If a soul as devoted as Padre Pio could be brought to the edge of despair, what hope existed for ordinary believers facing their own spiritual battles? And what did it reveal about the nature of divine permission that such an assault could continue for years? The methodology employed by the tempter represented an evolution in spiritual warfare, a recognition that the saints of the modern era could not be defeated through the crude temptations that might have worked on less psychologically sophisticated souls. Padre Pio had spent his entire adult life in radical poverty, had embraced celibacy without apparent struggle, had surrendered worldly ambition so completely that offers of ecclesiastical advancement meant nothing to him. Traditional demonic tactics, the lures of wealth, sexual temptation, vanity, would glance off this friar's consciousness without purchase, recognized immediately as enemy attacks and rejected through disciplines he had practiced for decades. The tempter understood this and crafted something far more insidious, an assault that required deep knowledge of Catholic theology, intimate understanding of the spiritual life's actual mechanics, and patience to work with the slow accumulation of doubt rather than the instant gratification of obvious sin. The diary reveals that this demon studied Padre Pio the way a general studies enemy fortifications, identifying not the strongest points to attack, but the hidden vulnerabilities that could cause systemic collapse. The primary weapon was theological confusion, disguised as spiritual discernment. The tempter would introduce thoughts during Padre Pio's prayer that mimicked the voice of conscience. That sounded like legitimate spiritual guidance, that used the exact language and reasoning of the moral theology texts the friar had studied in seminary. These thoughts would raise questions about the nature of his mystical experiences, suggesting that what he had interpreted as divine communication might actually be psychological projection, that the visions he experienced might be products of an overactive religious imagination rather than authentic supernatural encounters. This line of attack was particularly effective because it weaponized Padre Pio's own commitment to truth and his fear of spiritual deception. The Church had warned him repeatedly about the dangers of false mysticism, had investigated his stigmata and other supernatural claims with an appropriate skepticism that sometimes bordered on hostility, and the tempter used this institutional doubt as a doorway, suggesting that perhaps the skeptics were right, perhaps he had been deceiving himself and misleading others for years, perhaps the entire edifice of his spiritual life was built on sand. The diary entries from this period show Padre Pio attempting to fight back with the standard tools of spiritual combat: increased prayer, more rigorous fasting, frequent confession, appeals to his spiritual directors for reassurance. But the tempter had anticipated these responses and crafted counterattacks for each defense. When Padre Pio increased his prayer, the demon intensified the sense of divine absence, making each hour of attempted contemplation feel like shouting into a void, creating the visceral impression that heaven had closed its doors and that his prayers were bouncing off celestial walls, unheard and unwanted. When he confessed his doubts and fears to his spiritual directors, the tempter would inject thoughts during the confession itself, whispering that perhaps he was manipulating these priests through his reputation, that they were offering him reassurance not based on spiritual discernment, but on their own investment in believing that Padre Pio was holy, that he was participating in a conspiracy of delusion that served everyone's needs except truth. This created a closed system where every attempt at spiritual remedy became evidence of deeper corruption. Every defense against doubt was reinterpreted as proof that the doubt was justified. What made this tactic so devastatingly effective was its foundation in partial truth. Padre Pio was not perfect, had struggled with scrupulosity throughout his religious life, did experience moments of genuine uncertainty about whether his mystical experiences were authentic, and carried legitimate concerns about whether the attention he received from pilgrims and the sick might be feeding pride rather than serving God's purposes. The tempter did not need to invent these vulnerabilities, but simply needed to amplify them, to take the normal self-examination of a serious spiritual practitioner and transform it into an obsessive spiral of self-accusation and despair. The diary shows Padre Pio writing lists of his faults, analyzing past decisions for evidence of secret pride or disobedience, reviewing his entire spiritual history through a lens of suspicion that found corruption in even his most innocent actions. A kind word spoken to a visitor was reinterpreted as seeking human approval. A moment of joy during prayer was examined as evidence of spiritual selfishness. Even his desire to serve God was questioned as potentially being a disguised form of self-service, the ego seeking validation through religious achievement. The theological sophistication of this assault becomes apparent when examining how the tempter addressed Padre Pio's understanding of suffering and redemption. Catholic theology teaches that suffering can be redemptive when united with Christ's passion, that the cross is not meaningless torment, but the pathway to resurrection, that saints throughout history have embraced suffering as participation in divine love. Padre Pio had built his entire spiritual identity on this foundation, had accepted the stigmata and his other physical torments as his share in the work of salvation. The tempter's masterstroke was to suggest that this entire theological framework might be a beautiful lie, a way that humans comfort themselves about unavoidable suffering by pretending it has cosmic significance, that perhaps the universe was indifferent to his pain, and that the meaning he had constructed around his torment was nothing more than psychological defense mechanism. These thoughts would arrive during his moments of greatest physical suffering, when the wounds in his hands and feet burned with particular intensity, when his body was exhausted from lack of sleep and the constant demands of ministry, when his psychological defenses were lowest and the pain made him most vulnerable to despair. The diary entry from June 19, 1928, represents the nadir of this spiritual siege, a moment when the tempter appeared to have achieved victory. Padre Pio wrote of experiencing what he could only describe as the sensation of damnation, not as a future threat, but as a present reality, a conviction that God had already rendered final judgment and found him wanting, that his soul was lost despite all his efforts, that the suffering he endured was not redemptive, but simply punishment for sins so fundamental that he could not even name them. He described this state as worse than any physical torment, as a darkness that made previous experiences of spiritual dryness seem like mild discomfort, as an absolute abandonment that suggested God had not merely hidden his face, but had actively rejected him and removed all grace, leaving him to face the demons alone. The handwriting on these pages is barely legible, the words crowded together as if he was racing to document this horror before it consumed him completely, and the water stains on the paper suggest tears or sweat or both, the physical evidence of a soul in absolute crisis. Church officials who read this entry understood why it could not be made public, why even now access to these documents remains restricted, because this level of spiritual torment in a canonized saint raises disturbing questions about the nature of divine protection and whether God permits his closest servants to be brought to the edge of damnation as part of some larger purpose that remains hidden from human understanding. The resolution of Padre Pio's crisis did not come through dramatic supernatural intervention, through an angelic visitation that banished the tempter with celestial authority, through a mystical experience that restored his shattered certainty, or through any of the mechanisms that religious literature traditionally uses to resolve spiritual warfare narratives. Instead, as the diary reveals, the turning point emerged from something far more paradoxical and theologically profound, a surrender that looked like defeat but contained the seeds of victory, a recognition that shattered the tempter's entire strategic foundation. This moment occurred in the early hours of July 7, 1928, after a night of particularly intense spiritual torment, when Padre Pio had exhausted every defensive technique in his spiritual arsenal and found them all useless, when he had prayed every prayer and received only silence, when he had confessed his doubts and found no relief, when the weight of perceived divine abandonment had pressed him into a state where continued resistance seemed impossible and perhaps even pointless. It was in this moment of absolute spiritual bankruptcy that he wrote an entry that would become the key to understanding not only how he survived the tempter's assault, but how the demon's tactic ultimately destroyed itself. The entry reads like a man who has stopped fighting and instead accepted what he believed was his damnation. But in that acceptance something shifted that the tempter had not anticipated. Padre Pio wrote that if God had indeed abandoned him, if all his suffering was meaningless, if he was damned despite his devotion, then his only remaining choice was to love God anyway, to continue serving without hope of reward, to persist in prayer even if those prayers went unheard, to embrace suffering without the comfort of believing it redeemed anything, to be faithful to a God who might have rejected him simply because the alternative was to become something he could not bear to be. This was not the heroic faith of certainty, but the desperate faith of someone clinging to goodness even when goodness appeared to have abandoned him, choosing love in the face of apparent evidence that love was futile, maintaining devotion without the support of spiritual consolation or theological assurance. The tempter's entire strategy had been built on making Padre Pio doubt his worthiness, on convincing him that his relationship with God was conditional on his spiritual state, on making him believe that abandonment was evidence of rejection. But this response escaped the trap by accepting unworthiness while refusing to stop loving. What Padre Pio discovered in this moment of absolute despair was a foundation beneath the foundation, a bedrock of faith that existed independent of spiritual feelings or theological certainty or mystical experiences. The tempter had successfully destroyed his confidence in his own holiness, had convinced him that his spiritual experiences might be delusions, had made him question whether God heard his prayers, had stripped away every consolation and every assurance, but could not touch this final commitment that required nothing but will. This was faith as pure decision rather than emotional state, as choice rather than feeling, as loyalty that persisted regardless of perceived reciprocation. The diary shows this realization dawning gradually across several entries, Padre Pio working through the implications of this new foundation, recognizing that if his love for God was not contingent on God's apparent love for him, if his service was not conditioned on reward or recognition, if his devotion persisted even in the face of what felt like damnation, then the tempter had no leverage remaining, because every weapon depended on making him believe his relationship with God was transactional. The subsequent entries document what can only be described as the tempter's retreat, not through exorcism or priestly intervention, but through the demon's apparent recognition that the tactic had failed and that continued assault would only strengthen what it was trying to break. Once Padre Pio had discovered this foundation of unconditional devotion, the whispers of doubt no longer carried the same power because he was no longer deriving his identity from certainty about his spiritual state. The suggestion that he might be damned lost its sting when his response was essentially acceptance, combined with determination to love anyway. The insinuation that his prayers went unheard became irrelevant when he decided to pray regardless. The questioning of his mystical experiences stopped mattering when he chose to serve, whether or not those experiences were genuine. The tempter had invested years in constructing an elaborate psychological prison whose bars were made of doubt and whose locks were operated by fear. But the prisoner had discovered that none of it actually constrained him once he was willing to act as if the prison did not exist, to walk through walls that were substantial only as long as he believed they could contain him. The theological implications of this victory are profound, and perhaps explain why the Church was reluctant to publicize these details of Padre Pio's spiritual combat. The traditional narrative of spiritual warfare portrays faith as a shield that protects believers from demonic attack, righteousness as armor that demons cannot penetrate, and divine grace as the power that defeats evil. But Padre Pio's experience revealed that the most sophisticated demonic assaults could penetrate all these defenses, that grace might not prevent spiritual torment even in the holiest souls, that faith itself could become the battlefield rather than the weapon, and that victory might require not the confidence of knowing God's love, but the willingness to love without knowing. This presents a far more challenging and less comfortable picture of the spiritual life than most believers prefer, suggesting that the closest approach to God might involve periods of feeling utterly abandoned, that the saints endure torments that would destroy ordinary faith, that holiness is measured not by the presence of consolation, but by the persistence of love in its absence. The Church that benefits from presenting straightforward narratives of good triumphing over evil through prayer and devotion was understandably cautious about emphasizing a story where the saints' greatest victory came through embracing apparent defeat. The final entries in this section of the diary show Padre Pio reflecting on what he had learned through this ordeal, attempting to articulate for himself, and perhaps for future spiritual directors, the nature of what he had endured and overcome. He wrote that the tempter's great mistake was believing that faith was a feeling or a certainty, that devotion was dependent on spiritual consolation, that love required assurance of reciprocation, when in fact the deepest faith might be the choice to trust when trust feels impossible. The most authentic devotion might be service without reward, and the truest love might be the determination to be faithful to someone who seems to have abandoned you. This understanding transformed his relationship with suffering itself, no longer requiring it to be redemptive in order to endure it, no longer needing to understand its purpose in order to accept it, no longer demanding that God explain the reasons in order to continue trusting. The tempter had tried to make Padre Pio's devotion conditional, to create dependencies that could then be exploited, to build a faith structure that would collapse when specific supports were removed, but had inadvertently forced the saint to discover a foundation that required no supports because it was built on nothing but the will to love, regardless of circumstances. The silence of the tempter. After this turning point is documented in the diary through the absence of entries describing the specific theological attacks that had dominated previous years, replaced by notes about other forms of spiritual combat, but none with the same existential intensity, none that threatened the core of his faith in the way this demon had threatened it. Church officials who studied these documents during the beatification process noted this shift and interpreted it as evidence of divine protection finally manifesting. But Padre Pio's own interpretation seems to have been different, suggesting that God had permitted the assault to continue precisely long enough for him to discover this deepest foundation of faith, that the trial was not punishment or abandonment, but a kind of spiritual education that could only occur through enduring what felt like damnation without losing the capacity for love. This reading transforms the tempter from a demon who nearly destroyed a saint into an unwitting instrument of sanctification, the enemy whose most sophisticated attack accidentally revealed spiritual resources that might have otherwise remained undiscovered. And it explains why the church that eventually canonized Padre Pio remained ambivalent about making these diary entries public, because they suggest that the path to holiness might require facing not just difficult trials, but experiences that feel like absolute abandonment, and that God's greatest protection might not be preventing such experiences, but ensuring that they ultimately fail to destroy the soul they were designed to break.